Welcome everybody to Life.Examined. We have another session we're doing online due to COVID and other factors, distance being one of them. But what we're going to do today is what we typically do. We are going to be working through some interesting ideas. But what is Life.Examined, you might want to know? Well, Life.Examined is an organization of a group of us who get together to work through philosophical issues in a very practical way. Life.Examined is really, the purpose of this is to dig down and ask questions about our philosophical ethos. What is the cultural categories? What are the ideas underlying how we think that affect how we live our lives? And that's the purpose of what we do. We usually do live events with people in an audience, but now we're going to be doing this format for a little bit and exploring some hopefully interesting ideas together today. Miriam, would you like to say a bit more about the format for today?
Yeah. And we have a guest, which is, and our guest is in America, which is so cool because we're the three of us are in Sweden, and this is something that we really can work very much with these days. Just trying to find the positive, you know. So what we're doing is we are trying to be example philosophers, take ordinary things and try to find the universal in the particular, like a real philosopher would, and. So using things like curiosity, that's one. Curiosity and wonder about, try to find what's interesting in everyday things. So Josh, please welcome our guest and introduce him.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, before I do that, we haven't introduced Matthew. Matthew, you didn't say who you were.
All right, I didn't say who I am. That's correct. Right. I missed that whole part. I am Matthew Nowachek, and I am a philosopher sitting here in Lund, Sweden.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know who Lund, Sweden is, it's down in southern Sweden. And I'm Joshua Bronson, and I'm sitting, and Miriam as well are in Gothenburg. Which is in sort of West Coast, not central Sweden, but sort of West Coast Sweden. So that's where we are. But yes, today, as everybody can recognize, we have a guest with us, and that is Caleb Bronson, so my brother, which is pretty cool, and he is in the U.S. And Caleb, you can just say a little bit about sort of where you are and introduce a little bit about yourself, and then start us off on our topic for today.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I am sitting here in Portland, Oregon, which is on the west coast of the U.S. I was in L.A. just a little bit ago, but we moved up here. L.A. is expensive, and family planning, like we don't want to raise our kids in L.A., etc. A lot of reasons to move up here, but it's very, very nice up here. And I like what Miriam just said about the natural curiosity and wonder is the it's the beginning place of philosophy, and I think for me that has held up in literature and in reading and writing both. I'm fascinated with words, fascinated with story concepts and plot lines, and that's something I've always been fascinated by, and I was thinking that perhaps maybe where we could start, if I could launch it off in this way, would be to reflect on how it is that a word transmits meaning. And I think maybe you guys have broached this subject before, but I remember when I was in high school or thereabouts that I would read a page in a book and I would think to myself, how in the world are these little scribbles of symbols transmitting into my mind, a picture of the world, a different perspective of the world, and that is such a mysterious thing. And while speaking language might be natural in some degree, reading isn't. And so we've taught our brains to read, and that's something that we have to be. We go through a long process of learning how to do. And hopefully at this stage it feels mostly natural to all of us. But I think that's just a fascinating thing, and I wonder if you guys have any insight into the connection between the symbology or the symbolic nature of language or writing specifically. That could be two separate things, and then how that connects to meaning and what we understand about meaning.
Excellent.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. Yeah, I love this question.
Me too. Me too.
So I mean that's an interesting. So what do you think? I'm thinking of like just the most basic, right? So if we start really basic with a basic word, so something that names. So in a way, like naming something is a basic way that words connect to the world. So you might say, one of the first things that we learn as children is the name of either our parents. Is normally one of the first things we say. We say mama or papa or mom or dad, or we use a word that names, that picks that important character out in our world. So are you kind of wondering? Are you wondering? Because that's not writing yet. So we're not to writing yet.
Correct. Right.
So that's a simple way that like a word that we learn a word that connects to something in the world. But is there a distinction, do you think, between that, Caleb, and like when you write it down? So you write down mama, or you write down a name in that way. Is that different than what you have in your head when you learn it as a child?
Well, I think perhaps it's just a level of abstraction, perhaps, in the sense that while we learn how to ascribe a name to something like a physical object in the world, then it's just one more step to ascribe that same physical object and do a shorthand for it by writing it on a piece of paper, right? And that could be just one step removed from the actual thing.
Yeah, I mean, you could come up with a story that would go something like this. That would say, so you hear a series of sounds that you connect with a particular object, and over time you learn to connect that series of sounds with that object. And so then when you learn to write, you just learn to associate a series of scribbles with a series of sounds, which associates with a thing in the world, and then you just build up everything like that, right? And that might be a very simplest way. I think there's problems with that kind of a story.
Right. I mean, it's interesting though when you talk about we build it up. I think that's really important. That there's a temptation. I think we can start with a well-developed account of language, and then forget that there's a sort of developmental process, both cultural and individual development, that's involved in that. So we can think like, when I use this word, I have a direct association with what that means. But what we're missing is that there's in fact an interesting cultural, historical process that's leading us to make these sort of associations that itself, I think, has ambiguity built into it. I'm hoping we can get into like ambiguity in language today as well, because I think that's super fascinating. When we come to the idea of, I mean, what are we representing things directly? I mean, that's a one view of what language is doing, what writing is doing, is that we're representing pictures directly. But there are people who have struggled with that idea. I mean, Wittgenstein himself had a view of that early on, and he kind of abandoned that view of language. But because there is this cultural ambiguity built into it, and which is something we've really talked a lot about in the last 30, 40 years with the rise of postmodernism, whatever that means.
But Miriam, did you have something you were going to say there?
I'm dying here to throw in a few concepts, but because when I'm thinking about this, which I love this topic so much, but I'm thinking that there are like all the different things that are happening when we talk about language, and when we talk about naming, and when we talk about like the relationship between the thing and the name we put on it, and who is talking, etc. So I'm thinking, so some of the things that we can talk about is my favorite is sound and the voice. And speaking as one part of using words and language, and then there's also reading and writing, of course. And then we have the voice, and then we have the letters that we use to make words. So, for instance, in the Hebrew alphabet, the shape of the letter is extremely important, and there's like so much written about, say, the tiny bend in the Yud letter, and what it means, and what it sort of encompasses, and where is God hiding, and what is coming forth from how the letter is formed. So that is extremely. It's not like a random process of just using. You know what I'm saying? So there's something important in the letters, and then there's the voice that says it. So I'm thinking, for instance, again, biblical reference. So I'm thinking, let there be light, and then there is light. So, and the text goes, I don't really know the English one, but let there be light, and then there was light. So it's like one sentence that makes the light come, and this is like the sound. The sound makes it come. The speaking, you know. But if we can't say light with the sounds, nothing happens, or something else pops up, or whatever. And then the second sentence, and there was light, is not the same kind of sentence, because it doesn't make things happen, you know. But it's sort of it talks about what has happened, or something like that. So this is like I'm just saying everything that's in my head at the moment. And then another part is the naming, where there are two important sentences. And one of them is what you name, you become master of. So again, the biblical. I'm like completely when you talk about letters and words, the Hebrew seems a good place to start, and the Bible. But then Adam and Eve get to name the animals, so they're masters of them. But also, what you name, you invoke. So if you name the light, you say make it come, or something like that. So that's just lots of things.
Super interesting, Miriam.
Can I like turn this? So there's a lot there, right? So can we turn this towards you in a second here, Caleb? Because I was thinking. You've done quite a bit of writing, sort of creative writing, right? Writing fiction. And so I'm wondering, like, when you... Because, I mean, you picked up on a lot of interesting things here, Miriam. So, like, if you're thinking of an idea and you want to express... You want to express that idea. I mean, the biblical language there, right? There's a way in which we talk about it as the creation, right? So the creation, and that includes a speaking into existence. But when you're... Because how you started this off, Caleb, you were talking about meaning, right? Like, how do the words, you know, like reach out, as it were, into the world? So when you're looking to write a fiction, because there's something interesting about that. Like, you're, in a way, you are creating. You're not creating the physical universe like God perhaps did in the beginning, right? But rather, there's still a creation going on. So when you're selecting words, how does that feel like from the inside?
Yeah, that's a great question.
I want to know that.
Yeah. Well,
because it feels mostly frustrating for the rest of us, but I don't know.
Well, I was basically going to say the same thing, that, you know, I think it's much easier to think about someone like Tolkien and step back and say, wow, look at this world that he created. I think it's a bit harder to be Tolkien creating the world. And not that I'm trying to be Tolkien, but it's true. I think that there is something about our ability, humans in general, to create whole worlds in our imaginations that are parallel, or they bear some sort of resemblance to the real world, and there's. We are capable of suspending disbelief, and that's a great phrase that's used in all types of entertainment. Is, the suspension of disbelief, and there's a connection between creativity, imagination, and the suspension of disbelief, the willingness to step out into the unknown and formulate something that hasn't been thought of before. So when I'm writing, I'm frequently trying to do to imagine real people. How do real people respond in these situations, and then allowing allowing a story to come forth, so that creativity is strange. I mean, it's different. It's not how I imagine God created the world. And then I ask, well, how do I imagine that God created the world? And I think that language is such an interesting starting point with God saying, "Let there be light." That's an interesting way to situate language, like the speaking forth, and that throughout the Bible, throughout Christianity, that's a very powerful concept. Is that there's power in words, and that actually influences reality. And so I think there is a phenomenal connection to writing and creativity in that way, because the words that you are using are creating a world that is not real, but if someone reads that work of fiction, to them it's real, in the sense that whatever's happening in that story in your mind is actually happening in some degree, right? So you are vicariously experiencing something. You're gaining wisdom or knowledge based on events that never happened, right? And that's amazing.
But I mean, can I jump in here for a second, because I want to connect something that Miriam said to what you just said, Caleb, because I think this is really interesting. Yeah. Like, you just gave a description of your writing process, and then a description of the person who is reading your writing, and for them it's like this experience of this whole new world. They're surprised by it. But I think from what you were describing, and even, I mean, I haven't done a ton of creative writing, mostly academic writing, but even in academic writing, there's this sense in which what we're doing is, it's a performance that it's not simply that we are in our writing describing some phenomenon. We're actually in the performance of writing itself. New things are emerging. It's kind of like when I say to my wife, I love you, I'm not giving a description of how I feel. I'm actually performing something in the very use of my words. And when we write, I mean, I love the idea of you're creating real people, you're creating characters, and then letting them act out reality, and in some sense following along in their own path. And in some sense, you as a writer are being surprised just as much as your reader is at what is emerging out of this performance of writing itself. I think that's so fascinating.
But, I mean, isn't that an aspect of writing and speaking? Is that it is, and this is one of the things that Wittgenstein picked up on, right? Is one of the things about it is that it's not fully private. So in doing that, so I mean, because you named the death of the author. That's what I was going to say. But you named postmodernism, Matthew, and in some of that, there's this there's this idea of the death of the author, right? That the author disappears, and there's only this sort of purely experiential thing that happens. But I think there's something it overemphasizes. Though there's part of that might be true. It overemphasizes something. It goes in a way too far, because there is something. So you're writing a story. Let's say, Caleb, you've written a story. In that creative process, there is something real that is happening. Because, and the reason why we know that, you could say, is because when you read a story that is in a way too unreal, you're like, it's not a good story. And so there is something which you're picking up on. So the characters need to act realistically in some way. Now you might create a new scenario where you're in space. You're in a situation that we've never encountered before in some way. But there's still a sense of that it's grounded into the reality, and that there's a communication going between author and reader. Right? I mean, there's still something going on there. So the author doesn't disappear entirely.
Yeah. There's can we say there's a background of shared meanings in which this new phenomenon emerges, which itself makes it meaningful.
But there's a background. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. There's a background of shared meaning, and I would want to say that background of shared meaning is not fully socially constructed, to put it precisely, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
that's really nice.
Fully.
Yeah.
Partially, but not fully.
Exactly. Because I wanted to say that when you're writing and when I am reading a book, I am also creating the story. I'm a co-creator of the story, precisely because this is the difference between reading a book and watching something on Netflix. Because on Netflix they give you everything, the sound and the beginning and with the way people look, and you have exactly everything. It's like the reason why I don't really enjoy that. I'm a reader. I like to read because and the reader is a co-creator, and I think this is one of the. This is like the main thing about language, is that it in itself always creates, because we also make up words and we put words together that don't really normally match. And I also work in the translation business, so you can see like what happens in the process of mirroring something in one to another language. it's like it's super interesting.
You had
how the
go back.
Can I just throw something in there? This is just a total side comment, but I agree with you entirely, Miriam, about the difference between Netflix and a book. But I also think that's interesting in how you explain that, because it shows how much I think we privilege visual and auditory. Netflix has yet to come up with a way of helping us smell a show or taste a show, right? But we often don't think about those. So there's still a possibility for us to have a little bit of creativity and flexibility even in Netflix. But I totally agree with your picture here of the difference between Netflix and a book.
Yeah. Well, the same. Oh yeah. So the same process still applies in creating any form of like media. Let's just say entertainment. I think that's a bit of a misnomer, but like any movie or show, what's happening is someone has written out a storyline. Someone has crafted a story, and what I find fascinating in seeing both that in literature and in TV shows, let's say, is often, and maybe you guys have experienced this too, that I will think to myself, wow, the writer, the author has died in the sense that the writer is touching on concepts that maybe they weren't intending to, but they've tapped into. And this is where I think there's meaning is somehow in the universe, is that they've tapped into some archetypal existence or structure of the universe, and that's why they're so impactful. That's why certain stories last or stand the test of time, or certain shows grip the nation. They're touching on core realities, and some of those are socially constructed. Like we have a social awareness about. I try to think of some examples, like a social awareness of how authority treats subordinates, right? And so there might be a certain way of understanding that based on your culture or cultural background. And so those can be modified, but there are perhaps true elements that are overarching, cross-cultural through time. And when stories touch on those, and I think they can happen in Netflix or in a book, even in academics, then that's it stirs me, at least. It stirs me, and I'm like, oh, you've touched on something amazing.
So
and maybe continue. Sorry.
I just to throw in a couple of thoughts there from before I lose them entirely. I was thinking of one thing is that I think academic writing and creative fictional writing isn't so far away from each other as sometimes we think. In the sense that you mentioned academic writing, Matthew, but I mean, obviously academic writing oftentimes has a lot of creativity in it, but it's also doing something similar. I think in this sense, it's attempting to point to or elucidate, bring out something about the world around us, right? And that can be done in fictional writing as well as in academic writing. It's just that they're slightly different, different frameworks of doing that. But I think at the same time, I was thinking about something that there's another tell, you could say, another sign that language. In some way, and we're trying to figure out how that is, right? How is the linkage between language in writing or in speaking connected to the world? And I think there's a tell that it connects because of the way that we at times use language as a weapon or as propaganda. So if you think about how sometimes we name things in a particular way in order to obfuscate something, right? In order to hide. So for example, you might say that people, innocents died in the battle, and so instead of saying that civilians were killed, you say that there was collateral damage. Right? So you're hiding the meaning by using a word of something else. Or one of the good on the Joe Rogan show just recently, he was talking about how about anti-fascists, and he was saying that it was ironic that there's these certain groups that call themselves anti-fascist in order to hide very fascist behavior. So there's this way in which you can call yourself exactly the opposite of what you're doing, and that's a tell that the words are supposed to connect to something that's actually there.
And that sort of also says that that almost, I was going to say, when Caleb, when you were talking about how certain shows can convey these very deep universal themes, kind of thing, archetypal themes, and I almost wanted to say, well, almost everything does that all the time. Like especially these, if you want to say that, because the story again is someone is evil, we need to get them away, you know, and that story comes all the time and all the time and all the time. And then in any writing and in any story and especially in the news, especially, you know, you want to say, make people know who you think is bad.
Right. So you use you use the language, the archetypes, you use the categories to try and set somebody else in a particular light, in order to, because everybody agrees that the bad thing should be done away with. And so if you can term this thing as a bad thing, then we should get right with it.
Exactly, because nobody thinks that bad is good.
Well,
so as long as you know, so as long as you make sure that everybody agrees on what's bad, and in this way, that was my point coming now. In that way, it's like everything creative that we do with language, and almost everything we do with language is creative in this way, that it sort of creates the world. And when we use language, like we said, it's a structure that pre-exists us. Like we are born into this sphere where we are taught what things are called and how to use words in a meaningful way. But at the same time, we use them in unique ways, and we create things that didn't exist before. So in that way, we are all kind of conduits. For you see that it's like a really
Could we say that we use language, but language also uses us?
Why not?
Or like it's like we are sort of reusing the same themes or something. Like it's what's important is important everywhere. Who is bad? What to do? How to behave? Like these philosophical questions.
And that actually comes through in the world of literature, because there's generally accepted like 7 primary story types, and all stories rotate, fall into one of those categories or dip into multiple, but you can whittle them down into those.
And if they don't, we're like, we sort of we end up looking at them going like, what happened?
Like this is a failed story.
It doesn't quite.
What's interesting is I think there's a connection to this and what Josh is saying with the ambiguity and the obfuscation. Great word. Got to use that more.
It's good.
But there's
me too.
There's a potential for deception, and so I think that is such a fascinating concept, that you can have, you can think that. You can think one thing about the world because of how someone has used language, but it's not true. And you guys have talked about this, and it can get messy. But it's things will not correspond to the way that those words have situated the world, and that can happen in stories, That can happen. You can use bad guys incorrectly, You can.
Interesting,
And that. So here's a great. I'm going to pick on him just because, but in I think it's in Thor Ragnarok, Marvel movie. The villain, Helen's. Whatever her name is, Helena.
I don't know.
Something like that. The villain. she's evil because she's evil, And there's no connection, and so like Miriam, what you're pointing out is that you can create a bad guy and assume that everyone's just going to be on the same page. Oh, that's the bad guy, but there's actually something more that's needed. It's not just that the world is evil and good. There's more behind it.
So I mean, can I jump in here? That gives me. I mean, I have 2 really short questions I can throw back to you guys based on that. The first question is, it seems like ambiguity is baked into language, and there's ways of using language ambiguously that aren't necessarily nefarious. And then there's ways of using it that are in fact nefarious. So I'm interested in the difference between those two, the dividing lines, the conditions that separate those two out. But also, Caleb, I want to throw this back to you. You don't have to answer this right now, but is it possible to talk about a moral use of language in the same way in literature, in story construction, as it would be, say, in political speech? I think it's a lot easier in political speech, for example, to point out how language obfuscation is actually immoral for certain reasons.
Right.
It doesn't seem to me as clear in literature how the same moral standards apply. So I'd be interested in hearing your perspective on that as well.
Exactly. What's the difference between telling a story and lying? Like, what is the difference?
Good. Can I just pick up on, just before I forget, pick up on the Marvel theme there? Because I think in the end game, when you've got Thanos as the bad guy, one of the brilliant things, I don't know if Miriam or Matthew, if you've seen those movies. No, you haven't? Okay.
I have. But
okay. So one of the reasons why Thanos was a brilliant bad guy is because you have a story, right? You have an explanation. Unlike in Thor Ragnarok. I mean, like, Thanos has a story. He has a reason. He has a logic, and the actions that he carries out make sense within that story. So he's doing something, but you're led to the point where you realize that his objectives are morally reprehensible. But you understand why he's doing what he's doing. And that's why he's a good.
You have compassion for him.
A bit.
Contradictorily,
Absolutely.
I mean, could it even be the case that the better character as an evil person is pushing more on the ambiguity? I mean, there's a sense in which the best villains are those that have this shred of goodness in them, and that's almost more terrifying because they're not simply black and white, but their characters are more reflective of the ambiguous nature of human beings in general, which I think is really scary for us because it actually throws us back in our face as human beings and throws our own ambiguity in our faces.
Can just one more thing, and then Caleb, you have to answer this. You have to answer this question.
What about Spider-Man? Come on.
I was just thinking that it seems like language is there is some kind of tenuous connection between language, words, the meaning, and the world that it's trying to describe or whatever, and that is flexible, but not infinitely so. So you can force. So you mentioned those 7 different archetypes of stories, and we can talk about words and how they relate to the world. We talked about obfuscation and lying, and so a word can point to something, and it can do so in flexible ways. So there are ways in which there's cultural construction in how we do that, but that flexibility isn't infinite. And one of the things that shows that is that it's very difficult to force a language into a prescribed sort of ideology, right? So if you say you can no longer blah 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 use language like this, then all of a sudden you're trying to sort of force that connection in a way that sort of breaks the language. So you can talk about how you've pushed the language beyond its bounds. You've broken it somehow, and then it no longer works in some way appropriately.
That's great thought, and just off that, before I respond to Matt's question, devolve, or when you use a word to start to capture too much, then the word actually loses clarity or specificity, and therefore actually, it results in confusion or a lack of meaning. Actually, when there's too much meaning. For example, I was just talking with one of my friends this morning about the word love and how that's used in English. There's one word for love which covers a very wide range of situations or feelings or emotions or attitudes. But then, in other languages there are multiple variations of the word love that have a tighter lane of meaning. So that's an interesting reality.
Yeah, and in a way it's not bad, because all of these things are love. So it's also interesting to say I see love in this range of things.
Yeah.
You know, but maybe you could have like love and then a suffix or a prefix or.
But that's interesting with the shift of language. I mean, I'm thinking in terms of Thomas Kuhn's paradigm shifts when he talks about moving between one paradigm in the scientific community to another. It seems like you begin to push in one direction, then members of the scientific community start kind of joining sides and joining in this new paradigm, and at some point it flips over, right? And I wonder if words kind of work the same way. Like if you take the word sick, it has a very clear meaning up until maybe, I don't know, the 1980s when surfers and skaters start using it in a certain way, and then a community starts to rise up around this word sick, and before you know it, now it suddenly means cool. But it also means unhealthy or how we traditionally think of sick. But there's a strange communal shift that happens, and you're right, you can't push it too far, but it pushes far enough and the community can get behind it, and then suddenly now the community is giving weight to the word itself, which allows for this shift to happen, language to evolve in that way.
Well, it might almost be easier to flip the meaning of a word, right, than it is to bend it. Because if you use the word in its opposite, it can, it's like a wink. It's like, oh, that's sick, meaning the exact opposite. Like, and maybe it's easier to do those switches. I'm thinking of a situation where that doesn't work in that. So I read the book. I'm not sure if you guys have heard of it, but called White Fragility. And throughout this work, she uses the term racism in a new way, right? And she's partly trying to do a useful thing in that she's trying to engage people who don't consider themselves racist. She's trying to engage them to discuss racial issues, but one of the consequences, or maybe intentional or unintentional, I don't know, but is that the word loses any of its previous significance. It loses the previous importance of the negative of being racist, or however you might describe that, but. So that's an interesting. By bending that word, by changing its meaning, it's doing a lot of like confusing things, and I think it's an example of where it's harder to bend a word than it is to just flip it.
Well,
but then,
good.
Yes.
I was going to say that's really interesting because there's a way in which so in philosophy, oftentimes when you talk about arguments in logic and so on, you can say that when you're going to try and accuse somebody of presenting a bad argument, oftentimes one of the ways that you can do that is by pointing to where in their argument they smuggle in something some content that's not in the premises, and I think that can be a rhetorical. That can be a rhetorical technique, right? A rhetorical technique is to smuggle in something that adds moral weight to what you're saying without having to argue for it. But what's interesting about maybe with White Fragility is that it's almost like it's not smuggling something in. It's rather like a sleight of hand, where you switch the meaning of something and then you use that term with its moral weight, but you're actually talking about something else, and so then you end up creating a mismatch between the two. But that's really fascinating, right? Because there's a way in which you're using the tool of words to do one thing, but you're in a way behind the scenes doing something else, and it's that ambiguity. It's playing with that ambiguity and how it relates to the world,
which happens a ton. Oh, sorry, Miriam.
What? Okay, I'll just go first. And that also brings in the speaker who is talking and who is using these words in a new way. I was just imagining when we talked about sick meaning cool. So if I would say that, I'm just giggling. I'm imagining my 12-year-old daughter just going like, come on. So if the wrong person is trying to use these terms, and we can imagine lots of very loaded words that we can absolutely, I mean, I can't use them, I can't say them, I can never say them. because I will be so offensive. You know, if I'm the speaker comes in here again,
right.
And
good point.
So so before I said that we're all kind of conduits for this creative force of language, but so that also means that we are sometimes not, like Caleb was talking about in the beginning, and not really aware of the themes that we bring up, because they just come like. They just fill the space where we are talking, but the speaker again has something to do with this, and what about the speaker? The speaker's position in society or something, or in the family, or like you see the way I use the word position, like the speaker in relation to other the people who are listening. Who is this person, and also the speaker's intent. Like this is really.
Oh,
yeah.
Good. Oh,
I think this has so much to do with creation.
I think you just picked up on something really good right there, because you just mentioned position and the relation to somebody else. And I think one of the things, like, so language is flexible, and language evolves and develops, and it can be used differently in different communities. But one of the things that it's flexible, but it's always anchored into the world, right? So you're not able to fully separate that out. And this is actually maybe this is a slight tangent, but just a slight tangent. So in artificial intelligence and in a lot of the work that relates to that, there's an idea that's called cognitivism, which assumes that cognition, that is thinking, has to do with symbol manipulation. And then the idea is that because a computer can manipulate symbols, that it can do cognition. But one of the problems with that is that it seems there's no connection between symbol manipulation and the world. Once you have symbols in a system, you can manipulate it any way you want according to certain rules, the rules that you set up in the beginning. But I think what we see in language is something very different, because we can manipulate those symbols to a certain degree, but we can never escape certain logical structures and certain connections back to the world, because if we do, it completely loses its meaning. So we're stuck using certain kind of logical ideas that are built into the language.
Well, then we should push that idea even further, Joshua, and talk about, the importance that doesn't seem right away initially so obvious, but the importance of embodiment for language as well.
Good.
Because that seems to be, if we want to push the AI argument, if that was the problem with good old-fashioned AI, is it didn't have an account of the body, and that's seriously problematic. Now current AI is trying to work with accounts of embodied consciousness, but the body has to play an important role in language, and maybe that connects even to what you're talking about, Miriam, how certain groups have a certain should we say allowance to use certain language based on certain embodied ways of existing within the world.
Or at least it makes sense of what. I wonder if it, because that's. Well, how can you say that again? Because that's quite interesting. Whether or not.
Because I guess I'm wondering about I think the liberalist tradition, the feminist tradition, I think are both kind of converging here in their criticism of the way that language is used and how it's been restricted to certain groups, or certain people are able to use it. Which there's this parallel attempt to free language in both the feminist line and the liberalist line in interesting ways, right? Feminism and liberalism don't usually go hand in hand here, but maybe they do in this respect, that there's a challenging of the use of language based on sort of an implicit embodied account of what language is. So we talk about from the feminist account, there's a sort of masculine embodied account that dictates how language should be used, which plays itself out in our realities. I don't know where I'm going with this.
I'm not sure.
I think. When I was very much into feminism during 1996 to 2006.
It was 10-year period.
Like a clear 10-year period.
The feminist decade.
So one of the things that I remember studying at university was how some group of feminists had wanted to start calling themselves... I don't believe that I'm saying this now, but I am apparently. They wanted to start calling themselves cunts because they wanted to reappropriate this word,
right.
And that is what that is something that I was thinking about, because that would be that. Then it's so clear how how important is the position and the intent is for using certain words, and especially what you name, you invoke. Like, what are you invoking with this intention, and what am I invoking with that intention?
That sort of reinforces what I think I'm not really sure what to think about, but it sort of reinforces what we were saying earlier, that language is flexible but not infinitely so. So it's like we run into, we kind of, if there's not a way that something develops in a way naturally in language development, then it's very hard to force changes by edict, right? That doesn't seem to work.
Yeah.
Right. There seems to be a dance though between these two. I mean that there's an ideological leading of some sorts, but it can't be forcing or pushing too much. There has to be a sort of grassroots cultural change happening at the same time.
Yeah.
But oftentimes, I think you're right. We end up erring too much on the ideological side, or we're just saying, all right, here's how you're going to use this language now. I mean, hence, Jordan Peterson, that whole uproar in Canada. About wait a minute, we can't just say how we're going to use language here.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's partly because it breaks that kind of connection. Maybe the mistake there is the assumption that because language has certain social ideas and constructions that are included in it, that therefore all language is socially constructed, and therefore you can just change it by edict, right? By social agreement, convention. But I think that's a mistake. Just because there are social constructed elements of language does not mean that the whole entire thing itself is socially constructed. So you can just sort of do with it what you want.
It's not just a power play. I mean, there's a lot more.
Which is kind of like what you were saying earlier, Caleb. That like when you look to try and create a character in your story. It's not like you're just free to create that character in any way you want.
Right. Yeah. There has to be some sort of I think the word is syllogism. Yeah. There has to be some sort of connection to what reality is. You know, and it's so hard to define, but
fascinating.
But it is how I think we conceive of language, and it's why these battles over language are they become so moral and therefore passionate, political conversations, because when you're changing the language, or controlling the language, let's say, because that's another dynamic that happens. People sense that you're actually trying to shape reality, right? You're not just changing If words were completely disconnected from the world, if they were truly only symbols, then sure, just shift the symbols around and whatever. Reality hasn't changed.
Yeah.
But I think we sense that even if we don't have a good explanation for it, or at least I don't right now, how it is, the mechanism by which language connects to that reality, we still act as if it's true.
Right.
And
because it has really serious concrete consequences. I mean, if you think about the Rwandan genocide, the way in which language was used on the radio at that time, I mean, it had serious real life consequences.
Well, and I'm thinking back to the Great Plan in Communist China in 1958 to 61, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately, for various reasons, and the way that language was used then was you can only speak positively of
the state,
Zhao's his plan, like there. So there was a.
You mean Stalin?
No. This is in Communist China.
Do you mean Great Plan? Oh, okay, so you said right. Okay, in China, yeah.
In
sorry.
China, yeah. So what happened? Yeah, Mao Zedong, and the way in which language played a role, I think, if we were to investigate it a little bit, is that there was only a certain set prescribed reality that you were allowed to speak, right? There was only a prescribed reality that you were allowed to agree to. And the consequence was not that anyone was particularly evil in the situation. You know, maybe you could point a couple fingers or a couple people, but no one wanted to be wrong and to be punished as a consequence. And so the result was upwards of 30 million people starved to death. And it wasn't that anyone necessarily was ill-intentioned, like wanting to kill people, but it was that they created a language, they created a framework for understanding their reality that didn't match up to reality. And this backs up some theory that I've had for a long time that our perceptions of reality or the way we conceive of the world and whether we speak truth or lies will result in a friction with reality, and that the longer you persist in disconnecting your language or your beliefs from the way things actually are, the more friction that will generate, and I think that's a great storytelling tool as well.
And that's true, and that is what Freud discovered, because what was his cure called? The talking cure. And that is that you speak your like same as in China. I mean, the reality doesn't go away just because you refuse to talk about it.
Right.
You know, and that is what Freud is with all the repressed feelings and etc. So the talking cure, to be able to speak it and leave it, you know, if you put it in the sphere of language.
So the once again the performative reality creating aspect of language and writing.
And then we have what we talked about in our episode on protest or riot.
Oh, yes.
That's what we've been.
Right.
What do you call it? The mostly peaceful protest.
Yeah. Well,
mostly peaceful
exactly.
protest. Yeah.
I'm sure you see a lot of mostly peaceful protests in Portland right now. But okay, so just to switch, because I think we can tie this off with a good question which Matt had earlier, which we can each try to give our answer to, and I think this will tell us a little bit about where we've come. So the question, which I don't think you quite answered, Caleb. The question is it possible to use language in fiction in a morally wrong or right way? Because I think that question then it really highlights that connection, that string back to the world, right? Because if you think how would we answer that? And we can go around and answer that question in some way, and then we can sort of tie it off.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
That was a really good question. I think that's a great. It really does force the issue. It's a great. It forces that connection. Like where does that connection lie? Yeah. It's really. I've been been on the back burner of my mind this whole time, and I'm trying to wrap my mind around that, but. So when I think about let's take the Lord of the Rings series as an example. I think when you're reading the Lord of the Rings, when you're reading a work of fiction, you are agreeing by reading it to enter into. You're suspending your disbelief. It's one of the best forms to get someone else's perspective, because you are saying, okay, I'm going to dive into your perspective and so I think, let's see, how do I say this? The difference between politics and fiction or discourse, public discourse and fiction, is that in public discourse, you are not generally trying to dive into someone else's perspective, whereas in fiction, you are trying to, and so you're already willing to enter a world where it's going. Your sensors for moral ambiguity or trespass is going to be significantly lowered. So I think it's harder to see it. So then, what I would say is, as I read through Lord of the Rings this last year, Julie and I read it together, and I noticed something that he actually has. He has a view about reality. He has a view about life that I'm picking up from his story, and I don't agree with it. It's hope is just the commitment to fight until the end, and knowing that you're going to die anyways, right? And that's basically the status of the world. There was the good old days,
sort of a Sisyphus kind of battle of
it's right, a Sisyphean type of scenario, and so did he do anything morally wrong from a writing perspective? I mean, oh man, that's so hard to say. I can't really put my finger on that, but I can say that the book opens up an opportunity to look at what his individual view of the world is, and then I can talk about that view of the world, and try to make sense of.
Nice.
Yeah. This is super hard. I'm actually gonna have to think about this a lot more.
I mean,
I'm getting lots of good ideas though.
I mean, I can jump in, Caleb, and piggyback on what you just said there, because it while you were talking, I was just thinking about this, that maybe it's the case that when we want to talk about morally suspect fiction or immoral fiction, we're also saying it's some sort of dishonest fiction. And what I mean by that is there's a way in which you can do fiction in which you objectify everything. You become this sort of powerful subject that controls and dictates everything. Instead of what we've been talking about is allowing the world in some sense to communicate to you, allowing characters to be themselves and to then communicate something to you. So it seems like an honest kind of fiction has at its heart, at its core, a robust account of vulnerability.
Right.
In the sense of we don't know exactly where we are going, but we have to be open and vulnerable to being taken places that we don't know. When I come in with an ideology and attempt to control and to shape fiction, then we're really moving into something more like propaganda, which I would say is not honest or good fiction. So maybe we can talk about dishonest fiction and immoral fiction being of the same kind, or there's some connections there.
Yeah, that's a very helpful distinction, and that gets my mind out of the rut I was in of thinking about only people that are genuinely trying and honestly trying to write a work of fiction, right? They don't have an agenda, as it were. There are many fictional stories which you sense right from the beginning. It's like, it's trying to convince you of something, right? And it's trying to smuggle in something, and all of our sensors go up, and we're like, you can't tell me what to believe or something. So that does happen quite often, and I think that's what makes if speaking of movies, that's what makes a great movie from a bad movie is when they're trying to convince you of something and they're using the symbols or the story to capture you into that view. And of course the people that like it are the ones that already have that view, right? And so it's interesting.
Right, so one thing is my computer's just gone to energy saving mode, but we're close, so just saying.
Perfect.
Should I go get the cord, or should we wrap up?
We can wrap up.
We should wrap up anyway. Yeah. Okay, so I'll do that now. Yeah, so I was thinking about how I was thinking when you were talking about the fiction writer and how you can get the sense of the fiction writer's worldview. I thought about the writer's or the speaker's position and intent, and then I thought the next thought was immediately the reporter, the news reporter, and I was thinking there is no such thing. There is no one can only report. You're always creating with language when you're writing because of position and intent. And then I was thinking the most important thing when you are writing is to take responsibility for your creation. So that this is in answer to the question of whether you can be an immoral fiction writer. So the way you take responsibility, this is like a lifelong task, I guess, to be someone who recognizes your responsibility, and that's really difficult when you don't know your intent and you don't know your position, which we don't really sometimes, at least, or it changes or something. So this is like our task as writers and as speakers, is to not be the tyrant who decides everything, but to be more like the conduit, and to in that way discover, find our responsibility for our creation, and to discover our position and our intent. That's like my last thing. No, I have one more thing, but I'll save that for later.
All right, so I'm I'm struggling here. So because I don't know what it is, but I kind of feel like, I don't know. I kind of want to disagree here to the idea that both Caleb and Matthew, which you guys just pointed out, which is that when a fiction writer has, if I got what you guys said, if I heard it correctly, which relates to language, but anyways, so is that if a fiction writer,
the way you co-created it,
yeah, the way if a fiction writer has a particular view which they're trying to get across, then somehow they're in a way misusing and I feel like that can't be the case because what I feel like it might be is something like this, is that if the fiction writer is getting across an ideology which we disagree with, then we feel upset that they're trying to get us to agree with their picture of the world. But then that doesn't seem to quite get close enough to what's going on. So that's one thing. But then.
But can I just jump in real quick? I think what Caleb and I are in on. I won't speak to you, Caleb, but we're not saying that you don't have a position from which you begin. I mean, everybody does.
Yeah.
So we're not claiming some sort of radical disconnected objectivity, but I think what I'm pointing to is that the move to then objectify the rest of the world, or objectify characters, or objectify to become a power domineering subject in the process of objectifying.
Sure.
That's where we then enter into the area of dishonest fiction.
Yeah, so that's good. But I'm wondering what that means because I guess I'm wondering what it is to, how else could you write a story other than like when you're creating a story, you are creating a view which by its nature views the world as a particular object. So it's like you can't write the story without the story itself getting a view. Now you might do that. I mean, you might do that in different ways. But then this relates to the other question, because the other part of the question was, can you do this in a moral way? So this was my thought. If you are a moral realist, which I am, so I think that moral categories relate to something that exists in the world. So if you're a moral realist, then part of the question is whether or not language, how does language, so we've been talking about how language relates to the world. If morals are in the world, then it's a further question how language relates to those moral truths. And then how can you do something with them that counteracts those moral truths in some way. But if you're not a moral realist, then maybe you have a simpler way of explaining how you could use language in an immoral way. Because if morality is a fiction and language is a fiction, then you can just put them in the same category, and then you can do wrong things with your language. But in a way, it's only wrong to the extent that it is wrong in the language game that you're using, but it's not connecting to the world. So then it's easier in that way. But I don't think that's right. But anyways, I'll leave it.
Maybe this won't help at all, but maybe it will. Maybe Kant's second formulation of the categorical imperative, the means end, is kind of what I'm trying to get at here. Is that it's, I mean, of course you treat the world as an object, but not strictly as an object. There's always a sense in which the world transcends our attempt to contain it, and allowing yourself to be vulnerable to that is, I would say, a crucial or essential part of doing good fiction.
Yeah, it is, but is it morally right or wrong? And that's that further question, right? Because question, it's like you could just say, well, this is just bad fiction because you're treating the world as a too simplistic of an object. But I think we're gonna have to leave it there because it's going too far.
We can do a part 2.
We can do a part 2. Yeah, that might be a good idea. But we should say thank you to Caleb for joining us.
Oh, sure.
Thank you, Caleb.
Thank you.
Yeah, no
and
problem.
everybody, thank you for coming and viewing this, and we look forward to having another session, hopefully soon.
Absolutely.
See you later. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, bye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.